I'm going to talk for a while about the problem of the large digital platforms, uh, mainly Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google. Uh, my title, Antitrust and Platform Monopoly, actually assumes what's a fairly controversial question, which is, are they in fact monopolies? Uh, and I will talk about that a little bit later because market power is actually a pretty important uh, element of the antitrust cases that involve the large digital platform. Okay, I want to start out with a little bit of introduction about what antitrust should be all about. Now, I'm from the US. My field is US antitrust law. I don't purport to have significant expertise in the antitrust laws of other jurisdictions. The one I know most about is the EU, but even there are plenty of limitations in my knowledge. So I'll be focusing mainly on the US perspective and US activities. So I'll just start by saying that the goal of antitrust, or at least the one that I think is most defensible, is antitrust should permit markets to achieve maximum output consistent with sustainable competition. That is to say, efficient markets produce maximum output, perfectly competitive markets maximize output. The output needs to be sustainable, which means that every firm that survives in the market needs to be earning at least a competitive rate of return. So, for example, there are certain cases where output is so high that some of the firms are not covering their costs, or there may be cases that involve strategic or predatory pricing that involves below cost pricing. But those things are not consistent with a healthy market as far as antitrust is concerned. So we'll articulate the goal in terms of maximum sustainable output. I don't like some of the alternative goals that have been articulated. One that is relatively popular in the United States is that antitrust should be concerned with the competitive process. The problem for me is that does not provide any tool for measurement. I don't really know what that means to say there's a competitive process. Output is something I can get my hands around. Now, that's not to say that measuring of output is not always easy. It's not, but at least we can conceive of ways it should be measured. Okay. And then secondly, as we're talking about the goals of the antitrust laws and the digital platforms, I think you want to avoid a couple of extremes. One is the extreme I see today in certain elements of the right in antitrust, which is that everything is fine with the digital platforms and the best thing that antitrust policy can do is stay out of the way. That was pretty close to the position of the United States, say back in the 1980s during the era dominated by neoliberal antitrust and Robert Bork, but I don't think it is today. And today, interestingly, we even have a consensus of people on both the right and the left that something needs to be done about the digital platforms. Although when you start unpacking it, you find out that both their motives differ and their specific recipes for fixes can differ quite a bit as well. The other extreme, however, is I think to believe that the digital platforms are inherently monopolistic and they must be broken up. I think that conclusion fails on both scores, whether they are monopolistic or inherently monopolistic is a fact that needs to be established. And the fact is that all of the platforms operate in multiple markets and they have varying amounts of market power depending on how you want to measure it in those different markets. And secondly, the idea that they must be broken up, I think, reflects a certain amount of naivete about the success that antitrust law has had in the past in breaking up large firms. I mean, to say that courts are not good at breaking up large firms is a serious, serious understatement. Most structural remedies have failed, with one exception, and that is unwinding of relatively recently acquired assets. So I would say you put into one pile undoing of mergers, and those can be successful depending on the degree of integration following the merger. But if we're talking about breaking up internally developed assets, then I think the courts are generally in pretty hazardous territory. Okay, so this picture is actually copied, it's photocopied from Bork's book, The Antitrust Paradox. It defined the welfare goals of the antitrust laws in the United States for a lengthy period. It incorporates a principle from microeconomics, from partial equilibrium analysis, involving a welfare trade-off. The idea was first developed in the context of antitrust. It was developed earlier in other contexts, such as welfare economics. But in the context of antitrust, it was first developed in the 1960s by Oliver Williamson. And Oliver Williamson argued that you can evaluate practices by measuring the economic harm, which he identified with the deadweight loss of monopoly, against any kind of efficiency savings that a particular antitrust practice produces. And you can discern from that whether the practice is welfare enhancing or welfare reducing, and that the goal of the antitrust laws should be to achieve welfare enhancing outputs. Now, just a few things about looking for just a few things about Williamson's picture. I'm sorry, I'm a little unfamiliar with this technology. I'm trying to experiment with the stylus here, but Williamson identified the social cost of challenged practices. Now, these are practices, the relevant practices for Williamson's analysis are what you might call the difficult ones. That is, some practices produce nothing but a deadweight loss, naked price fixing. When a group of firms gets together and does nothing more than fix the price, then the deadweight loss is present, but not the efficiency savings, because we assume there aren't any. Those practices are easy to condemn. Other practices at the other extreme produce plenty of cost savings, but they don't produce any deadweight loss at all, principally or frequently because the firms involved in the practice lack any kind of market power. So, for example, if 3 pediatricians in New York City should get together and organize a practice to handle healthcare needs of children, they could save a lot of costs. They'd be able to share a building, share equipment, share common staff. It's not likely they're going to be able to fix prices appreciably given the tens of thousands of pediatricians in New York City. And so we would look at that joint venture, that group practice, and say, well, its cost savings are significant and there isn't any deadweight loss, okay? Those are the 2 easy areas at the 2 extremes. In the middle are these practices that involve both plausible arguments for the creation of market power and also plausible arguments for efficiency. And I think it's fair to say that at least at first glance, most of the activities of the big digital platforms fall into that range. Okay, well here Williamson identified the the gray shaded triangle in the upper right portion of this figure, with the deadweight loss of monopoly. There was nothing new about that. The idea of the monopoly deadweight loss was actually apparent already as early as Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics in 1890. It was formalized in the 1920s and 30s. And it basically consists of the harm that occurs because the monopolist is able to reduce output with the result that prices go up. One critique of the Williamson approach is that that deadweight loss triangle is today regarded as sort of the minimum estimate of the social cost of monopoly. It ignores other elements of the social cost. For example, the mechanisms by which monopoly is created. If you take those into account, and if those mechanisms are inefficient, then the social cost of monopoly can in fact be quite a bit higher. Okay. Then looking down and to the left, you see the rectangle A2, which is the cost savings that results from Williamson's creation of this joint venture. Remember, this is a joint venture now that simultaneously, it could be a merger, it could be some kind of collaboration, some kind of activity that simultaneously increases market power and produces cost savings. And so basically, the rectangle at the lower left, the A2 cost savings rectangle, is a reduction in average costs that results from this activity. And then Williamson said basically this particular merger or joint venture or other action is welfare enhancing and should be permitted if the size of the gray triangle is larger than the size of the rectangle, and prohibited if it is smaller. Consistent with the welfare economics of the day, Williamson basically asserted that the white square to the left of the deadweight loss triangle, that's the wealth transfer, right? That's the area where consumers pay higher prices, but that output is still being sold. The deadweight loss triangle consists of output that is no longer being sold because it's been taken off the market. The wealth transfer is simply a transfer of resources away from consumers and toward producers. And under neoclassical welfare economics, that's considered a wash or welfare neutral. Williamson received substantial complaints at the time that the wealth transfer should not be considered welfare neutral for purposes of antitrust, but he adhered to that. Importantly, Bork adhered to that, and it has remained more or less controversial ever since. So, we say today, if efficiency is the only thing that counts, efficiency is neoclassically determined, is the only thing that counts, then antitrust policy is indifferent to higher prices to the extent that they reflect nothing more than a wealth transfer away from consumers and toward producers. Well, Bork took Williamson's model, which was created in the mid-60s, in a very important article in the American Economic Review, took that model, incorporated it into his very influential book, The Antitrust Paradox. And this figure, like I say, is simply a photocopy of Bork's figure. For Bork himself and for the people who followed him, the figure generated an enormous discussion about whether efficiency should be the exclusive goal of antitrust, how efficiency should be measured, whether the wealth transfer is welfare neutral, and so on. I just want to suggest that the one thing that Bork ignored, and largely because Williamson also ignored it, is the immensely practical but fundamentally engineering question, not purely an economic question, which is highlighted in that hand-drawn red rectangle at the bottom of this figure. That's my drawing, the red rectangle. And that is that in this picture, output falls by roughly 1/2. That is to say, the pre-action output was out at Q1. That was the competitive output. Under this joint venture or merger, output falls to Q sub 2. And just eyeballing that distance, it looks like that distance is about halfway. Now, Bork drew this figure, and so he came up with that particular ratio. The ratio depends on a number of assumptions. One is how much efficiency the merger or joint venture produces. Another one is how much monopoly power it creates. And even the shape of the demand curve is relevant to determining what the size of the output reduction would be. But it raises a very critical, essentially non-economic question. It's really a question of engineering and mechanics, which is exactly what kind of merger or joint venture produces this kind of welfare trade-off while also reducing output by 1/2. Or to say it a little more starkly, when do you get a joint venture or merger that reduces output so substantially and yet results in lower costs? Well, let's talk a little bit about where these efficiencies might come from, okay? By far and away, the most prominent set of efficiencies that arise in US antitrust analysis, and most of this is involved with mergers, far and away the most prominent set of efficiencies are economies of scale or scope, right? Economy of scale is a cost that goes down as the number of units goes up. Economy of scope is a cost that goes down as the number of different activities with common costs can be increased. It becomes quite valuable, for example, for platforms like Amazon, which have one platform, but they sell a whole lot of different things, or Facebook that has one platform, but engages in a lot of different activities. The thing about economies of scale or scope, however, is that they virtually always accrue on higher output rather than lower output. Now, it's not invariably true. You can think of situations where a firm might be able to reorganize production, distributing it over multiple plants or something, and achieve certain economies of scale, even at lower ranges of output. But economies of scale and scope in the ordinary case are not something that we would expect to result from a practice that reduced output, and particularly not one that reduced output this substantially, okay? A second limitation that Bork also did not discuss is what about the presence of fixed costs, okay? Fixed cost is a cost that is typically invested once, typically at the front end, and then it remains unchanged as output varies. And the thing about fixed costs is that per unit fixed costs are always inversely related to output. That is to say, if output doubles over a common set of fixed costs, then fixed cost per unit will go down by 1/2. Or more importantly here, if output is cut in half, then fixed cost per unit will double. And the real important qualifier here is that in markets that are capable of achieving monopoly, we ordinarily expect fixed costs to be quite substantial. That is to say, if a market doesn't have any fixed costs, we usually think of it as a market that is not readily capable of being monopolized, because fixed costs are the thing that most constrains uh, uh, new entry. So that then leaves the question, which I introduce here, which is, does this picture really describe anything that happens very often in the real world? Or is this an example of something that Ronald Coase once derisively called blackboard economics, which is basically the fallacy of thinking that if you can draw a picture of something on a blackboard, then you have described something that actually goes on in the real world. Okay. Now, my own view about the relationship between output and antitrust is sort of captured trying to get move my slide here. Got it. Thank you. I do apologize. I'm using this platform for the first time. I think the best way to think about the relationship between antitrust policy and its output maximizing goals is that they lie on an inverted U, which means what? Well, the place where we want to be is at the top of the U. That's antitrust policy, consistent with antitrust policy's goal of very high output. If you go to both extremes, and this is something we're confronting in the United States big time, because we have a fair number of people who still defend the neoliberal Borkian approach, and we have this other group of people called progressives or Neobrandeis or some other name that want to take a radically different approach, and traditional antitrust more or less stuck in the middle. But the neoliberal or the Bork approach that we've just described typically leads to under enforcement, particularly when you see, going back to this picture, that Bork was willing to proclaim as efficient practices that in fact produced much higher profits, but also that reduced output. And antitrust has been working under that weight ever since the late 1970s, 1980s, when that was articulated, runs somewhat counter to the general goals of economic policy, which are to encourage higher output, but it does encourage high profits. And I think that's one of the reasons it's remained relatively robust in antitrust on the conservative end, particularly among business, because it does favor high profits. At the other extreme, the Neobrandeis approach is, just not to put too fine a point on it, dismissive of intellectual property rights and innovation, hostile in many cases to economies of scale and scope, frequently overly excited about bigness in and of itself, and as a result favors antitrust policies that I believe will result in lower output. So you get lower output at both of the two extremes, and I think the appropriate goal of a beneficial antitrust policy is to try to keep antitrust somewhere in the middle, which is in an equilibrium that forces prices to be close to cost, but also that permits firms to maximize their output. Now, a few things to keep in mind as we talk about the digital platforms. One is, and I think this is something that the Neobrandeisians or the progressives overlook, is that the large digital platforms have been engines of economic growth, very significant engines. They're not the only ones, but a very significant portion of economic growth, technological progress, employment, and certainly high-level employment has come about through the large digital platforms. By and large, at least in the US, I haven't looked at any European data, but at least in the US, the digital platforms all have very favorable consumer opinions. Consumers love Google and Facebook and Amazon. They have a more complicated history with competitors and particularly with smaller firms. And it's easy to paint with too broad a brush here. I mean, just to give you an example, Amazon. Amazon has unquestionably injured a lot of smaller firms, including driving some of them into bankruptcy. That's part of the story. But the other part of the story is that Amazon acts as internet broker for, by current count, 5 million small businesses worldwide that sell their products on Amazon. Amazon provides various degrees of distributional support. It'll represent the products on its website. It'll take care of billing, shipping. It charges money for all these things, of course, but for many small firms, Amazon has actually been a lifeline, and particularly through the pandemic. A lot of firms that would have gone bankrupt because they were small, relatively isolated in product or geographic space, have nevertheless been able to survive and even flourish because of their presence on Amazon. Everybody looks at, the fact that Jeff Bezos has made a fortune out of the pandemic on Amazon. Yeah, he has done that. But the reason he has done that is because the volume of sales through Amazon has gone up so incredibly much. And most of the things that Amazon sells are things that are produced by third parties. So, this is a wave and a lot of people are riding it. Now, I'm not saying that Amazon doesn't deserve some antitrust remedies, but we need to be somewhat cautious and circumspect before we launch in and try to condemn Amazon simply because it has been able to succeed and grow very large, and particularly through the last couple of years or so. Secondly, on the durability point, if you look at these dominant firms, yes, they're big today. They're not all that old. Google is, barely 20 years old. Historically, they have not been shown to be more durable than many of the traditional monopolies in U.S. Industrial history, like U.S. Steel, IBM, Xerox. All of these are firms that were once accused or convicted of monopolization in the United States, and all of them have now become much more competitive as a result. Thirdly, I guess, is I don't think any case can be made that the large digital platforms as a group are winner-take-all or natural monopoly markets. This is asserted in the literature almost as if it's obvious, particularly on the left, that the big platforms are winner-take-all markets. I don't believe it in most cases. I think the main reason they are not winner-take-all markets is product differentiation. That is to say, we've got models of natural monopoly. Natural monopoly is a market in which costs decline as output goes up. And if costs continue to decline all the way to the point that 50% plus one sale of the market is saturated, then the efficient number of firms in that market is one, and we apply that to things like bridges, roads, public utilities, and so on. But what all of those natural monopoly models have in common is they assume firms that share a single demand curve. That is, firms that are doing exactly the same thing. And the same thing is true of direct and indirect network effects. Yes, as more and more people get on one or both sides of a two-sided platform, costs in relation to benefits tend to go down. But once again, if you assume that those firms face this exact same demand curve, then you get the conclusion that they are robust natural monopolies. The fact is, however, that there are two different things going on here. One is economies of scale or network effects. And the other strongly offsetting feature is product differentiation. So if you ask me the question, how likely is it that a perfect clone of Facebook would emerge and succeed? I would say not very likely. That is to say, direct and indirect network effects, the platform economics favoring Facebook suggest that it has very little to worry about from another firm that does exactly what Facebook does. But that's not the way new entry into digital markets works. Most of the new entrants are differentiated. And if you open up your perspective a little bit to face a wider range of alternatives, you say that Facebook has actually faced several instances of new entry. Instagram was a new entrant who came in vis-a-vis Facebook. Facebook responded by acquiring it. And in the Federal Trade Commission's complaint against Facebook from late 2020, Facebook cites a fair amount of, the complaint cites a fair amount of literature, of emails, basically, in which Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, was very worried about new entry from Instagram, precisely because Instagram was addressing a different audience than Facebook did. In addition to Instagram, we've got Twitter. Twitter is a much later entrant that comes up with a very different business model. It remains smaller than Facebook, but it's growing fast. It's become kind of the preferred platform for antitrust, by the way, in the US. More recently, TikTok and so on. So the real question, which is a factual one, is are the possibilities for product differentiation significant enough to offset large network externalities or economies of scale? And I think that's a fact question. I think one of the reasons, for example, that Google search retains its 90+% of the search market is that effective product differentiation in search is not all that easy. There have been some attempts, but they really haven't gone very far. On the other hand, when you're looking at a multi-tool platform like Facebook or Amazon, I think the prospect for efficiencies for differentiated entry are much larger. And the bottom line here is the third point on this slide, which is that places a premium on merger policy. Because I think, I'll tell you what I think is happening. If you look at the major platforms today, they are acquiring small upstarts, new firms by the hundreds. And I think the principal activity there is that, number one, the platform operators realize that they are not operating in winner-take-all markets. They do expect that differentiated firms are going to provide avenues for new entry. And as a result, they buy up those firms before those independent firms have had a chance to emerge as large-scale successes. So, I think first and foremost on the antitrust agenda with respect to the large platforms is a much more aggressive merger policy. In fact, I would dare to go this far, although this is more intuitive than empirical, which is that because of their size and because of the number of markets that they operate in, I think there are relatively few efficiencies that the existing platforms can acquire only by merger. The vast majority of the efficiencies they need, they can acquire by internal development. The one exception would be a market shifting patent or copyright, digital copyright. However, in those cases, we've got a remedy, which is a non-exclusive license. That is to say, if some firm develops some new technology that Facebook really wants to get its hands on, it doesn't need to buy that firm in order to attain use of that technology. It can do so through a non-exclusive license, and that gives That would give Facebook everything it needs, but not the power to exclude others from having access to that technology as well. Now, I'm getting a little long here, so I'm going to shorten a little bit of this. But on market power, like I say, the title of this talk implied that these firms are monopolies. When you start looking at them more closely, you see that that question is pretty complicated. Yes, Google probably does have a monopoly market position in search. It has been able to resist significant entry, even by large firms such as Microsoft, and retains this very large market share in search. Now, there are some other things going on. One is that, at least in the US, Google search is the default search engine on Android devices. And because Google pays Apple several $billions a year, Google search is currently also the default search engine on Apple devices. That, by the way, itself suggests that search may not be a permanent natural monopoly because Google basically has to pay for the exclusivity it's getting. I don't think that issue has been fully adjudicated yet. Many of the other markets are more complicated. Android has roughly a 50% market share vis-a-vis Apple in the US. It has a much higher market share in Europe and much of the rest of the world. Amazon is a very big retailer. However, it is much smaller in the United States than Walmart. The big difference, of course, is that Walmart is a retailer whose principal physical presence is physical, while Amazon's principal presence is online, but it's not the biggest general retailer in the US. And then when you start looking at the individual products that Amazon sells, you get a very complicated landscape. Amazon does have a very large market share with web services, digital cloud services, and it also has a very large market share with respect to ebooks, largely because of its development of the Kindle devices, although then that also raises the question whether ebooks and printed books should be in the same relevant market. If you look at the wide range of other products that Amazon sells, it has pretty much a non-dominant share of those products in most individual markets. So the market definition question is a complicated one. The recent trial that took place between Epic Games and Apple, which the judge still has under advisement, had a great deal of very illuminating testimony about market power, where Epic alleged that Apple had a 100% market share of app sales on iPhones. Well, that's pretty much begs the question because yes, the only way you can buy an app on your iPhone is through the App Store. However, if you look at the full range of platforms where Epic sells its games, that includes Apple, Android, the two dedicated game stations like PlayStation, and also Windows laptops, desktops, and Macs. Then Epic Games' market share of sales on Apple falls to about 10%. And so there was this very interesting debate between two very distinguished economic experts, Richard Smolentsy, the former dean at MIT, and David Evans, about what the proper market definition was in the Epic Games case. We can talk about that later in Q&A if you want. My own view is that when we're dealing with market power on the platforms, we should be less focused on market definition and more focused on direct measurement. That is, using econometric data to measure price and output responses to changes. The platforms are a pretty good tool for doing this because pretty much all of their sales are digitized. One of the things about econometric measures of market power is you got to have good data in order to make them work. But in the case of the large digital platforms, we do have pretty good data. Okay, and then let me conclude here just by rattling off some of the other practices. Okay, we've talked about acquisitions of new firms. I think it's important that we ratchet that up. Uh, there are a number of contractual practices, including exclusive dealing, tying. That was an issue in the Epic Games case, that Apple was tying game sales to its platform. Uh, in the great majority of and most favored nation clauses, Amazon has been litigating its most favored nation clauses. These are basically clauses that basically say if you sell something on Amazon, you have to promise not to deal with a competing seller that charges lower prices. So Amazon always gets the best deal. They can be quite anti-competitive. I think for all of those, the best remedy is an injunction. Stop the practice. I don't think breaking up Amazon or Google in response to these practices is going to promote consumer welfare. I think one remedy that is undervalued today because we haven't studied it carefully enough is forced interoperability. And that would apply less to Amazon, but more to platforms such as Facebook and Google, which means information sharing, perhaps consumer database sharing. And in this particular case, I think, we can learn a lot from the breakup of the telephone industry, which occurred in the United States in the early 1980s, where we managed to break a unitary firm, AT&T, up into what is now thousands of small firms, but they're all firms that operate on the same network, and they operate pretty well. So, today the network links many, many carriers. It links wireless technology with wired technology. Everybody gets to be on the same network, but the network is developed within in a competitive environment. Okay, I think I've used up more time than I was allowed, so I'm going to stop sharing my slides. And Volker, if you've got some questions, I'll be glad to address those.